And my first guest today will be Samantha Stevenson, a history teacher at Christ College.
Would this mean that we would enter a US presidency sort of system?
Very possibly, yes. If we were to become a republic, I imagine it would look very similar to what it does now, because if we're honest, the monarchy doesn't really do a lot for us these days. They have the options of saying things and kind of changing laws or putting a stop to certain things, but they don't. They don't intervene, even though they have the power to. So I really think one of the main changes would be some changes in jobs. We'd lose a few jobs of people who work on behalf of the monarchy. But in terms of a sort of power system, there would probably be like a president or prime minister on top with some version of, it would be very surprising if New Zealand did away with the party system.
That brings me on nicely to my next question, which is, how much power does the monarchy already have?
On paper, a fair bit. Practically, they don't use it. So they have the power to make changes to our laws, stop, if we put in referendums, they have the right to stop them or, sort of overrule any of the decisions made by our government and our people. But they don't do that. They don't actually exercise that power, and they haven't for a very, very, very long time. So on paper, they have power. Do they use it? No, not really.
Say New Zealand did become a republic and we did leave the rule of the monarchy, would this mean we're still in the Commonwealth, and would we still be allowed to compete in the Commonwealth Games?
That's a good question, eh? A lot of people are worried about that one. I think we should, because we have still, have we not, spent 100 and whatever years, being loyal to the monarchy and to the British Empire. It is still a huge part of who we are. It's a massive part of New Zealand identity, and I don't think we'd do away with that anytime soon. So again, I think it would depend on the nature in which we became a republic. If New Zealand was sort of like, we're done with you, off you go, monarchy, and it was kind of on our terms and they weren't happy about it, I suppose they'd have the right to say, no, you can't be in the Commonwealth. If it was done relatively amicably and understandably between the two countries, I would imagine we would still be able to compete in the Commonwealth. Regardless, I think it would be a really important point that would be very heavily considered before making any decisions.
To your knowledge, do you know of any other countries that have done something similar to this, where they've left the Commonwealth?
I know a tiny bit, like a very tiny bit. Not a lot. They really continue to function very much the same way, with more money staying in their country. So at the moment, it averages about $1 a year we give to the monarchy. So per person living in New Zealand, we give $1 to the monarchy, which for you and I might not seem like a lot, but when you're talking $5 million a year, that's just more money that would then stay within our own country, logically, to then support our own system.
And what are your opinions on this? Do you think we should stay in the Commonwealth or not?
I'm really on the fence. I don't know. Actually, one of my classes did a project where they had to pick a side and argue, and I was convinced by both sides. I think there's some really good things about staying in the monarchy, but I do think there's a lot to be said, especially with the death of Queen Elizabeth. I think she was quite a poignant reminder of how kind the monarchy has been. She apologised for a lot of the atrocities that had been done by the Crown in New Zealand's history. So she was a really warm, friendly, reasonable monarch to have. And so New Zealand felt like they owed a lot of loyalty to her. And a lot of people loved her because she was such a warm and friendly person. Now that I think she's passed away and we're on to King Charles, I think that loyalty to the monarchy was actually loyalty to Queen Elizabeth, and it's not there anymore. So I think now would be, Jacinda has said it's not going to be anytime soon, but it's a tough one. I think there's a lot of pros on both sides of the fence. Yeah.
And as you mentioned before, Jacinda Ardern herself has said that she doesn't think this will happen anytime soon. What are your thoughts? Do you think this will happen anytime soon?
I think Prince Charles would have to have King Charles now would have to have a chance to prove himself. And I think if New Zealand and New Zealanders didn't like him, like his his kind of plans and ideas, even if it was just that he was completely uninterested in New Zealand. I think time will tell really what he is going to do for us or not do for us, or how important he's going to be to us. And then again, if he does some things that New Zealanders and the government don't agree with or think aren't quite right, then I think that could start to sway it. So it could be in the next 15 years, it could be in the next 50 years. Yeah.
And do you think if, say, we were to leave the Commonwealth and become a republic, do you think we'd have to get rid of the Union Jack on our flag or any other UK-related branding or items?
I think anything that's embedded in our culture, no, they can't take scones and cream away from us. But I think if it's about representing our country using a symbol or an identity that belongs to another, I suppose they'd have the right to request we didn't. Again, it would come down to if it was done amicably or not. Like if it was all fine, then they'd probably be fine with us using it. But again, would we want to? I mean, we had our flag referendum, and I don't think it stayed the same because people love the Union Jack. I think it stayed the same because the other options weren't that good. And it was the wrong time for a referendum. I think if we did it again at a different time with different options, I don't think that many people are loyal to the Union Jack. But I suppose, it'd depend on how it happened as to how hostile they would be about their Union Jack.
Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
For the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions released from their farms. New Zealand is the first country in the world to seek to put a price on agricultural emissions. The government's proposal was announced on October and open for consultation and feedback closing on 18th of November. There are strong opinions on the proposal on both sides of the argument. The Green Party has noted that the agricultural sector is by far New Zealand's largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The Greens
I'm Tasman Daly, and I'm here to talk about
maintain that New Zealand farmers need to do more to contribute to national emissions objectives set out by the Net Zero Climate Change Response legislation. The issue has been debated with farmer advocacy groups such as New Zealand Dairy and Federated Farmers, warning against adopting a framework that could put New Zealand at a competitive disadvantage from the international stage. The government proposal recommends a greenhouse gas emissions pricing regime that is more onerous for farm-level emissions. The government's proposal says that farmers and growers that are GSC registered and meet certain livestock and fertilizer use thresholds will be required to pay. I spoke earlier today with a spokesperson for rural servicing company PG Jurasson about the proposal to gain their perspectives on the proposal.
I'm Tasman Daly, and I'm here to talk about the new agricultural emissions pricing laws that have been proposed for public consultation. The New Zealand government's proposal for consultation is called the Pricing Agricultural Emissions. This proposal recommends accounting for greenhouse gas emissions by requiring farmers to pay for the greenhouse gases. Joined here by Julian Daly, who is the General Manager of Corporate Affairs of PG Jurasson. Julian is going to share with us his views on the pricing proposal for agricultural emissions. We will be discussing the proposal and the implications it might have for New Zealand if it passed into law. Firstly, should New Zealand farmers have a price set that they should pay for their agricultural emissions?
I think the majority of New Zealand farmers accept that agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in this country. They also understand that global warming, consequent climate change, is a serious problem globally that needs to be addressed. Farmers understand that they have a role to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand. However, the approach New Zealand takes in this area needs to be well thought through, as no other country in the world has priced greenhouse gas emissions for farmers. I don't think that the current proposal is well conceived, and I don't think it is quite the right approach. I think it could have a number of negative unintended consequences, such as significant land use change away from food production in rural New Zealand, and also a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions at a global level.
In terms of greenhouse gases produced from our food production, New Zealand is one of the most efficient primary food producers in the world. This presents a dilemma because the government's modelling shows that emissions leakage will occur, particularly in the sheep sector. That is, the decrease in New Zealand production will simply shift elsewhere internationally into less effective producers. What were your thoughts on this topic? Do you think this is an issue?
This is a real problem. The whole purpose of this exercise is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally and address climate change. Therefore, if the proposed pricing of agricultural emissions causes New Zealand farmers to reduce our production, with that production shifting to less efficient producers, we might actually increase global greenhouse gas emissions. That would be a very poor outcome for everyone. And if this proposed law change actually results in a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions globally, that would render the whole exercise counterproductive.
Could you provide an example of emission leakage that you think could occur?
Well, for example, New Zealand dairy farmers produce 10 times less greenhouse gases than Indian dairy producers to produce the same quantity of milk. Therefore, if New Zealand reduces its dairy production, with the consequence that India increases their production to replace that, and India has actually stated that it intends to increase its production, then the net result is that the planet is worse off, and we're further away from the ultimate objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to try and reduce global warming.
Do you see any other problems with the proposal?
Yes, if farmers are to face a price for their emissions, they should get proper recognition for the sequestration happening on their farms through trees, riparian plantings and shelter belts, etc. I don't think that the proposal adequately provides for this. The government's modelling shows that sheep and beef sectors are most heavily impacted by putting a price on emissions. This would be made worse by the proposed sequestration changes, reinforcing the importance of pushing for a fair recognition of sequestration for New Zealand farmers. I'm also concerned that the pricing proposal will cause detrimental land use change in rural New Zealand. The proposal will most likely cause large areas used for sheep farming to be converted into pine forests. This could be devastating for many provincial towns and rural areas. Also, this could proportionately disadvantage Maori farming interests and operations that are focused on sheep and beef production and are already more marginal operationally from a financial perspective.
As you can see from this interview, the stakes are high for the proposed agricultural emissions pricing. All the key stakeholders in the government and agricultural sector and climate change advocates agree that something needs to be done to reduce New Zealand's agricultural greenhouse gases emissions. However, there is no agreement about how to tackle this issue through regulation. Greenpeace and the Green Party feel that the emissions pricing proposal does not go far enough, while farming advocates warn that the proposal will impose unreasonable obligations on New Zealand farmers. They warn that the current proposal will drive significant land use change, with large areas of productive farmland going into pine forests and have only a detrimental impact on rural towns. They also feared that if New Zealand forges ahead as the only country in the world imposing pricing agricultural emissions, we will disadvantage New Zealand without any real benefit at a global level. This will be an interesting issue to watch as submissions close next week, and the government works through feedback from interested parties. With agriculture and primary exports being such a big contributor to the New Zealand economy, there will be some important decision to be made in the coming months.
As its teachers, because from English teachers to art teachers, Christ College students don't realise the way that people get their jobs. And so Human Resources Manager Sherry Clune was asked about how someone goes and tries to get hired here at college.
Human Resources Manager Sherry Clune was asked how someone goes and tries to get hired here at Christ College.
So the process is that all jobs are advertised internally through staff notices, through the Education Gazette, and through sometimes through other means where appropriate. Then the candidates are shortlisted according to their qualifications and experience, and then that shortlist is interviewed. We look at different policies as part of that shortlisting process, such as our equal opportunities policy, and the selection panel, which is the interview panel, is usually comprised of key members of the executive, namely Nicole Belante, Rob Donaldson, and usually the head of department of the area concerned.
Ms. Clune shared that the head of department is part of the interviewing process, and so I talked to Chris Waugh, head of the English department of Christ's College, about the subject of hiring a new English teachers and what they go through to get the job.
From our side, the process is all about just trying to get the best person. And we tend to spend quite a lot of time letting people know about us so that when they apply, they understand what we're looking for and what kind of department we are. So we publish information about how we teach and what our principles are. And then when we ask the teachers to come in, we do an unusual thing compared to other schools, and that is that we ask the teachers to do demonstration lessons as well as an interview. So we like to see them in the classroom with the boys before we make our choice.
Sometimes it's best to ask the head of department, in this case Chris Waugh, what he thinks are the qualifications needed to become an English teacher.
So the fundamental qualifications are a degree in English or a English-rich subject like history, and a teaching qualification for secondary. And on top of that, we also really prefer it if teachers also have further qualifications. So if they have masters or PhDs, that's an advantage for them. But on top of that, we look for teachers who can develop a really good rapport with students. So we know that they have to have knowledge, but we also care that they can establish a good relationship.
And so, for the best comparison, Mr. George, head of the art department, gave his own view on what personality and experience is needed for becoming an art teacher, and to see if there really is a difference for each subject, and what are those different traits needed for his own subject.
I would look at, firstly I'd look at their CVs and just see what kind of background they've got, what sort of education they've had. Probably the first thing I'm looking at is to maybe plug a hole. So let's just say that we've got a need for for a photography teacher or a sculpture teacher, I'd be looking for those things first, and so I'd be looking for that in their CV. And after I've kind of worked out, okay, they've got a great CV and they've got great references from people, and they've also just had a track record of just doing well, and their character is starting to come through just from their references. From there, I would start to look at honing it down to maybe 2 or 3 applicants that we could start to interview, and then just drill down a little bit further to find out what their character's like, how they deal with stress and those sorts of things, if they're reliable, if they're passionate about the subject, but if they're passionate about students, and I'd work through that.
And what qualifications do they need?
I'd be looking for maybe a Bachelor of Fine Arts. I think that'd be important. They should definitely have some sort of teaching qualification. Those would be the 2 key things. If they had experience in working in other schools, that would be again another bonus. If they were a practicing artist, for me, that would be icing on the cake. That would be superb, because that shows that they're committed long term to the subject.
Now, after hearing both of these audio clips, we must make a comparison between them and analyze them to see what they prioritize according to each other's subjects. And so, from the first interview clip of Darren George, he says,
Find out what their character's like.
This meaning that this is one of the key factors in becoming an art teacher, as in the way you portray yourself. While Chris Spore, when asked about what qualifications are needed, he never mentions the way they show themselves to students, listing things like
a teaching qualification, a degree in English. We also really prefer it if teachers also have further qualifications. So if they have masters or PhDs, that's an advantage for them.
This is probably because English is a highly contested topic in countries such as the USA and New Zealand, according to the SuperProf website, meaning that you can't just make it up as you go. You must know what you're talking about, and so the more qualifications and experience you have, the better your chances of getting hired at college. And there you go, the knowledge into what is needed to become a teacher in Christ College. From what is needed on paper form, as in qualifications, and something a little bit more abstract, as in personality.
mandatory language classes in school. The Head of Learning Support, Mrs. McKenna, believes we should not, while the Head of Learning Modern Languages for 2023, Ms. Tang, believes we should.
Thank you, Mrs. Tang and Mrs. McKenna, for agreeing to this interview. Our first question is, do you think that schools should have mandatory language classes?
I think it is important to expose students to learning a foreign language. So yes, certainly when they first start at college in year 9, I think that's important. As they get older, they make the choice of whether they wish to continue or not. But it means that they've had that exposure, and they've decided if they enjoy it or not. And I think at year 9 certainly, but as they get older, it becomes more their choice.
I don't think that every student should necessarily have to learn the language, because for some students it is a challenging thing, and if they are struggling with their basic literacy in English, then learning a new language can be quite a stressful thing.
What are the pros and cons of learning a second language?
I'm not sure there are any cons at all, actually. Learning a second language uses a different part of your brain. It opens up your mind to other cultures and also other ways of thinking about language. So, for example, in French and many other European languages, nouns have genders. So in French they can be masculine or feminine. In German they can actually be masculine, feminine or neuter. Whereas in Asian languages that I've learned, so Chinese and Japanese, nouns don't have articles, so that you don't say the or a. So that in itself is quite interesting when you compare that to your own language. So it's really just about learning about other ways of thinking.
I think learning a second language is wonderful for lots of reasons. It opens up another world and another culture to you. It enables you to travel to different places and feel comfortable with communicating with people. I think it's very good for us for our brain to be learning another language, and the discipline of that I think is very good. I don't see any negatives around learning another language. I think if you have the opportunity, it's something you would like to do, and that you are not going to find it a stressful thing to do, then it's just a really positive opportunity.
Do you think that English is an international language?
I think that many English speakers believe that it's an international language, because you think of a lot, like the countries that we hear about. What are the countries we hear about? We hear about America, we hear about the UK, we hear about Australia. So I think a lot of English speakers would think it's an international language, but we need to remember that, Chinese and Spanish are both very, very widely spoken. And also, the language of the European Union is French. So it's a widely spoken language. I don't know that I would say it's an international language. I think, all languages are very important in communication. Yeah.
That's an interesting question. No, not necessarily, because there are many people in many other places who don't speak English and don't communicate in English.
Do you believe that there is an international language?
Well, there's no language that you can speak anywhere in the world that can be understood by everyone. So, in Africa, some countries, their national language is French. Senegal is French. So, yes, Chinese Mandarin Chinese is spoken in China, but also in China, like there are lots of dialects. So my parents are from Hong Kong, but I grew up speaking a Chinese dialect called Hakka that very few people here speak. And because they were from Hong Kong, we listened to Cantonese music, watched Cantonese movies. So that, and now Hong Kong is part of China, but I don't speak Mandarin. So I don't think Chinese is an international language. I'm not sure any language is international. Maybe not even sign language. You've got, New Zealand sign language. Yeah. That's specialized to each country too. And that's part of why I think learning languages is important, because if you don't make the effort to see how other people live and to see how other languages work, then you're very much living in your own small world. And that's what causes a lot of misunderstandings and, kind of disagreements in the world. Like the way that we behave here could be considered shocking in Japan. Even something as simple as blowing your nose. Here, someone's got a runny nose, you just want them to blow their nose, but in Japan it's rude to blow your nose in public. So that kind of understanding of how different cultures work is really, really important. And in Asian countries, the number 4 is really bad luck. If you give it a gift, you don't give them 4 of it, because it signifies death. But if you didn't know that here, then you could very easily offend someone if you went to Japan, and we're trying to be nice to give them a gift. So I think, that kind of, that's why I think there is no thing as an international language, one international.
As the head of learning support, do you think new students should have the opportunity to pick 2 English courses instead of a different language?
That's an interesting question as well. Some of them, yes, I think, but probably because we do have the opportunity, and we do have boys who don't do a second language, and they do some extra English or literacy work and a learning support class. I guess it's not another necessarily English class as such, because when you think about an English classroom, you're thinking about the study of literature and all those things, aren't you? But certainly the opportunity to be able to strengthen their literacy and their own language rather than doing a second language, I think is important for some boys.
topic. It's been forefront of climate change because we use it for so much. But can we get rid of it here in New Zealand? I asked Patrick Phelps, who is the manager of West Coast Minerals, who said there'd be no viable energy source for food production in the South Island and parts of the North Island in New Zealand. And Kevin Haig, who was a Green MP, and he said, when you put a hard stop on something and say we're not going to do it anymore of this, it puts a constraint on the system. That is what makes people think of different ways that they could do it.
What is your point of view on the extraction?
I mean, I guess from my point of view on it, I'd say by and large a good thing. I mean, I work as an advocate for the mining industry, so people probably think I would say that. But New Zealand, particularly the West Coast, has been producing coal for export for at least 3 or 4 decades now. So coal exports out of the West Coast started in the either late 1970s, early 1980s, and just by way of a bit of an explanation, there's probably, a bit off the top of my head, but about 7 to 8 billion tonnes of coal get produced all around the world each year on average. But out of that, only about 1 billion, I think, are of what would be considered the grade for producing steel with. So it's a particular quality of coal that you need to make steel, and that's what is produced on the West Coast for export, and that gets exported into mainly into the Asia Pacific region. So India and Japan being the largest markets, but some also going in various quantities to South Korea, Australia, China a little bit, and a few other places. But yeah, so on the West Coast, you've got companies that produce quite a high quality of coal for steel producers, and they don't really have an alternative for that. But we produce quite small quantities compared to other countries, but the reason that those coals are so sought after is because they're of such a high quality. So yeah, anyway.
What impact do you see from the banning of extraction and burning of coal in and around New Zealand?
Well, there's a few different impacts that it would have. I mean, particularly, you would have virtually no viable energy source for food production in the South Island and parts of the North Island. So dairy factories, freezing works that process meat, hot houses that grow vegetables, and schools and hospitals that are still heated with coal, that they don't really have any alternative for that. So either the cost of producing all of those things would go up and then everyone down the line would be paying more for them, or more likely just see a lot of the dairy industry and meat industry in the South Island shut down completely. There'd be quite frequent blackouts in terms of power supply around the country as well, because you'd take about 5 or 10% out of the electricity sector, and then you wouldn't have that export industry for steel production. And in that case, there would be more coal used from other countries, probably with higher associated CO2 emissions. And on that note, the reason that some people would probably like to ban the extraction and use of coal would be because of the impact that burning coal has on the climate. Notably, when you burn it, you emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But even then, if you were to add up all of New Zealand's emissions, so that's all of the methane that you get from livestock farm animals, that's all of the oil that we get from use for transport, natural gas for food production and industry, and then coal. Coal actually only accounts for about 7% of New Zealand's total emissions. So your impact on emissions would be quite small, but the economic devastation would be enormous. And even the things that coal is used for producing for the export market, so we send milk overseas or we send some coal overseas for producing steel, it's very likely that would just occur in other countries, and the emissions internationally wouldn't really change that much. So yeah, if anything, they'd go up slightly because other countries tend to do things with a higher emissions impact than what New Zealand does. But yeah, anyway.
What alternatives do you see for the current use of coal?
In parts of the North Island, you could theoretically use natural gas, but we're sort of running out of that in part because we've banned natural gas exploration in the North, in New Zealand, particularly in the North Island. There are very few alternatives for it. So, like I say, the alternative would just be to not have as many factories producing as many things in New Zealand. On the steel side of it, without getting into a chemistry lesson, because I was pretty lousy at science at school anyway, the reason that you need coal to produce steel is that when you mine iron ore out of the ground, if you see steel get rusty, it starts to go red. That is because iron likes to be bonded with oxygen. There's quite a strong bond between those two things. And so to break that bond between iron and oxygen and drive the oxygen out, you've got to give the oxygen something else to latch onto. And at the moment, and for as long as we've been producing steel, that has been carbon. So historically, people used to use charcoal made out of wood, but a couple of 100 years ago, we started to use coke made out of coking coals. And when you go through that process, effectively, you're, for want of a better word, you're ripping the oxygen off the iron ore and then bonding that with the carbon through that process, and then it gets emitted as carbon dioxide, and that has a greenhouse gas effect. So the only way that people have really found to produce steel from raw materials from that iron without coal has been to use hydrogen, and it basically gets emitted as water vapor, H2O, because you've bonded the oxygen with the hydrogen. The problem is that most of the hydrogen that's produced in the world at the moment, it's a very energy intensive process. So 99% of the world's hydrogen is produced with gas and coal, which obviously also has has an emissions factor as well. So I can see proposed alternatives. I can't really see any that actually work in practice with the technology that we've got today.
What is your understanding of the environmental impact of coal mining and use for energy?
I guess there's two environmental impacts. There's the impact when you dig it out of the ground. So if it's underneath, say, vegetation like native forest on the west coast or native ecosystems, then you have an impact on that area for the time that you are mining it. But the rehabilitation methods, I guess, for putting that land back after you have mined it have become quite sophisticated, particularly in the last couple of decades, and the research has improved. You can't necessarily get it back to 100% of what it was, but you can get it a lot of the way. And so one of the methods that they have, it's kind of hard to explain without seeing pictures of it, but in some areas they have what's called vegetation direct transfer. So you use a digger, but you don't use a normal digger bucket. And it's almost like if you can imagine a fork coming in and taking the icing off the top of the cake and then shifting it and then putting it back later. That's sort of what they do. So it's not perfect, but it is pretty effective. And then you just control it afterwards for a while to make sure that you get no weeds and that coming in. But, different ecosystems have different things that work. So that's the point of extraction side of it. You try and put it back as well as possible. On the energy use side of it, yeah, like I've said, you've got the main issue being that when you burn coal, you combust it, you oxidize it, and that goes into the atmosphere as CO2. And, that's contributing quite significantly to climate change around the world. But as I said, in New Zealand, our coal use hasn't really gone up much over the last 30 years. The biggest part of the problem as far as New Zealand's concerned.
Well, I guess I should say that I used to be a Member of Parliament for the Green Party, and I also used to be the Chief Executive of Forest and Bird. Both of those organisations have strong views, and I guess my personal view is pretty well aligned. The climate change is an existential crisis. If we are to try and avoid or mitigate the very worst effects of climate change, we simply have to stop burning fossil fuels, and that's principally oil and coal. And therefore, to me, it doesn't make any sense for us to be continuing to try and open up new mines or new oil wells. We should allow the ones we've got to reach the end of their lives, but it means that the people working in them can continue doing the job that they're doing now, but not open new ones, so that we actually phase out those industries.
What alternatives do you see for the current use of coal?
Well, so for coal, there's two main things that we use coal for. One is as supply for energy, so thermal coal for creating electricity at times when the hydro lakes are low and there's insufficient wind to actually power up the grid. And the other use is coking coal for making steel. And here where we are on the coast, principally we're mining a kind of coal that's used for coking, so for steel making. But talking generally, for steel making, we're now pretty close to electric arc technology using hydrogen. So in Sweden, Volvo is now doing the first run of cars made with steel, that has been used using hydrogen rather than coal. And, that's a technology that's going to pretty rapidly take over around the world for steel making. And for thermal coal, actually, we kind of already have sort of a base load generation technology with geothermal, and we just are not using geothermal very sensibly at the moment because of the stupid structure of the electricity industry. So we've got a whole lot of companies, they're all doing their own thing, maximizing their own profit rather than working as a single whole for what is the best thing for New Zealand Inc. So what we have to try and do is have more renewable supply, so that's more hydro and in particular more wind, used in a way, and actually reserve geothermal for those times when those sources, the sun isn't shining, the wind, the wind's not blowing, and the hydro lakes are low. Use geothermal for that. There is also the New Zealand Battery Project at Lake Onslow, which you may have heard about, and the idea of that is to actually fill up a really big lake, and then not be generating electricity from that all of the time. You use that only at the times where the other hydro lakes are low. So that's like a mega sized battery. I also think we should be investigating properly what I would call distributed generation and storage. That's where individual households and schools and companies, farms, and so on are encouraged to have their own solar panels and battery systems, and that we actually then try and get those networked into sort of local networks, so that you might be, you'll have batteries, your neighbour's got batteries, the other neighbour's got batteries, and you probably aren't all trying to actually sort of download, use electricity at exactly the same time. But of course, renewable energy and distributed generation like that is seldom in the interest of the power companies. So that's not something they're going to be encouraging. And the last thing I should say is, actually, normally when you look at demand and supply, and so where's the mismatch, the most economically efficient solution is in trying to reduce demand, so reduce wasted electricity and more energy efficiency. So we should be doing a heck of a lot more of that.
What impact do you see from the banning of extraction and burning of coal in and around New Zealand?
I think, so there's an old saying that goes, necessity is the mother of invention. And James Shaw, climate change minister, says it a different way. He says, constraint drives innovation. And basically that idea is, okay, when you actually put a hard stop on something and say, we're not going to do any more of this, so put a constraint in the system, that is what actually generates people to start thinking of the different ways of doing it. And all of the time you can continue doing exactly what you've always done, the status quo, people will tend to be thinking in that way. And so we won't get the creativity and innovation that we really need. So I think, let's say we did what I've proposed, which is you allow existing coal mines to continue to mine coal to the end of their existing lives. You don't allow any extensions and you don't allow any new mines. So first of all, you've got all of those current users of coal who know, okay, this is the future for coal, this is the time frame within which we need to get a new solution. What we would see is rapid uptake of new technologies. So we're already seeing some of it, schools and factories shifting their coal burners over to wood pellet burners, for example. That would accelerate. We would see New Zealand Steel actually be saying, oh, maybe we should really look seriously at that Swedish technology around hydrogen. So you'd actually start to see people fairly quickly moving to that. The group that I'm always most concerned about is people who are working in the industries and the other companies and other people whose livelihoods depend on it. It's actually not that many people, so here on the coast, it's something like, actually the last time I looked, which to be fair was probably last year, and it might be a bit different now because the coal price is up at the moment, so there were about 300 people kind of working in the industry on the West Coast, mining industry, and that's no one in Westland, basically a small number of people in Grey and a couple of hundred people in Bulla. That's actually not very many people, And so there's this whole mythology about, mining's been the backbone of the coast. Actually, that's not really true. That was true at one point. It's not true now. But what I would say is, the government has set up a just transitions unit in MBI, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Enterprise, I think they're called. So the transition unit is supposed to be helping regions that are dependent, have industries that are ones that have to be phased out, like Taranaki with the oil and gas, to transition to something new. I think they've been pretty absent, and I think we should be putting a rocket under the government and saying, get your act together, help regions like the West Coast, and particularly Bulla, transition away from the activity that's coal mining, and for those people currently working in that industry, do something else. If you think about those replacement industries, there's hydrogen, there's renewable energy sources and storage, there's smart engineering jobs and redesigning the grid. There's a lot of high tech jobs, but also the lower tech jobs in those same industries that are created by the transition. And so what I would say is government should be stepping in, and for each of those people working in coal mining, you design a plan for them. And that plan might be, transition into another industry using the same skills they've got now, or it might be retraining, or in some cases it might be saying you're near the end of your working life. How about we just underwrite your wages for the rest of, until you're 65? Because actually there's hardly any people, so the cost of that is not great. And that's so that way the cost of transitioning away from coal doesn't fall entirely on those people who have to change the way that they make their living, because they've, in fairness to them, they've just taken up jobs that were available and were highly valued jobs at the time that they did. So, they shouldn't pay the cost. We should all share the cost of making change.
What is your understanding of the environmental impact of coal mining and use for energy?
So there are some uses of carbon, and I've been involved in this debate for the best part of 20 years, which is the time I've been living on the coast. And one of the things that I have suggested is, there are some uses of carbon that don't involve burning it. And if we've got coal that's suitable for making coal tar, for example, which is the raw material that goes into carbon fibre, then there's the possibility of a whole industry that still involves extracting carbon, but doing something different with it that doesn't create climate change effect. By all means, go for your life on that. But every other bit of coal that comes out of the ground gets burnt, and we're already at the point where I should have said that my first degree is in geophysics. So that's specifically the physics of climate change, atmospheric physics, oceanic physics. So I have some expertise in climate change, and we are reacting as a species far, far, far too slowly to tackle this challenge. And what that means is, I'm in my 60s. For me, it'll just mean more rainfall, hotter summers, and that won't actually make that much difference to me. But to you, to your generation, and the kids that you have, it will make a really major impact. So if we can live our lives, if we can figure out ways of running our civilizations that don't involve burning carbon, well, we absolutely have got to do that.
After speaking to Patrick and Kevin, I then went on to speak to Maureen Pugh, who is a national NP. What is your point of view on the extraction and export of coal?
Coal's been mined here in New Zealand since the 1860s because it is a very effective form of energy. We don't have, at this point in time, an alternative to that. So from my point of view, there have been communities that have evolved. There have been industries and supporting industries that have evolved over the last 160 years to support that sector. So at the moment, extraction and export of New Zealand coal plays a very, very big part in the economy of this country.
What impact do you see from the banning of extraction and burning of coal in and around New Zealand?
Well, the impact is quite obvious that without the energy source that we get from coal, we are going to have a gap in supply of energy. And it's not an easy one to plug. So if that gap was easy enough to plug, then we would certainly be doing that now. But the reality is that there is no alternative at the moment. And I've got some really interesting stats for you, Frank. At the moment, we would need something like 4 more Clyde dams for us to be 100% renewable at today's usage. So that's not accounting for growth or the change over to, say EVs and things like that. So 4 more Clyde dams, that means you've got to find somewhere to put them for a start, and then you've got to consent and pay for them. If we went 100% renewable on wind power, we would need 3 times the amount that we've built in the last 25 years, and that again is not accounting for growth. And solar. Solar's an interesting one. We need a 5,000% increase in the current stock of solar panels. And according to Genesis, we would also need $2 million worth of batteries for every house in New Zealand. And remember, it only works when the sun shines or when it's daylight. So they're not realistic alternatives to coal, but they are very good supplements to the coal burning for energy. So the other thing we've got to remember is that in New Zealand, we now make up something like, for our emissions, 75% of the international emissions, they are not priced through an ETS. And New Zealand pays $75 per tonne for CO2 emissions. And I believe that coal has actually hit $100 a tonne, but I stand to be corrected on that. So we're paying already 16 times the international average, which is $4.50 for CO2 per tonne. So that means that the energy that is produced, the electricity that is produced by coal, is extremely expensive. And so the cost of energy goes up. And when the cost of energy goes up, so too do the costs of all of the other things that we do with our coal. And here in New Zealand, we produce from that, including, our dairy industry, manufacturing. There's a whole lot of other things that we use the coal for. So without that energy source, that's what I see the impact would be of banning the extraction and burning. But you've also got to remember that
Good afternoon, I'm Matthew Geddes, and this investigative interview is about the government's new zero carbon bill for agriculture, which is just in the submission process now. I spoke to Nicola Grigg, MP of Selwyn and National Spokesperson for Rural Communities and Agriculture, Charlotte Glass, an agricultural scientist, and Andrew Reid, a local farmer, about the new bill. What do you think of the new carbon emissions bill that will be in effect in 2025, which will be the first of its kind in the world?
The Labor government legislated to bring agriculture into the ETS in 2025. Now, the farming industry thought that was going to be too difficult and too damaging to the sector. So the government said, okay, well, you go and work on your own proposal. And so this is how this He Waka Eke Noa partnership group was formed, and there's 11 different industry representatives in that group. So they came out with an alternate proposal that's very different to the likes of the ETS, and they gave that proposal to the government in May this year, and then what we saw last week was the government's counter proposal. Now, The National Party supported the Hawaka Eka Noa proposal that they gave to the government in May. We do not support the government's counter proposal because it's removed the ability for farmers to earn credits back through sequestration, for example. We think we will never support something that will see about 20% of sheep and beef farms go out of business. We're acutely aware of how very, very important the agricultural industry is to New Zealand, not just to our national economy, but the well-being of all of our rural communities, places like where you and I live. And so that's why we're really strongly urging the agricultural sector to continue with the submissions process. They've got until the 18th of November to have a say on the government's counter proposal. And we think, we actually do support agricultural emissions pricing because actually that is what our offshore consumers are demanding. But we will only support it if it does not put businesses out of business, and that it can almost be a revenue neutral kind of exercise whereby you pay a levy on your greenhouse gas emissions, but you can earn credits back through the carbon cycle. So that's what we will support, and that's why we really, really want the industry to submit on this, because we will support a proposal that the industry backs as opposed to what the government says.
Well, Matthew, I've got kind of mixed feelings about that bill because I'm quite concerned about climate change. It's a big issue, and I think we're probably seeing the impact of changing climate daily. So it's something that I think we need to make massive change with. But the detail of the bill itself, well, maybe I might have done that a little bit differently. But I don't mind that we're the first in the world to do something like this. And I think we're so small and our markets are so important to us that maybe that part.
I think it's an amazing thing for New Zealand's agriculture, where it'll put us on the map and it will create opportunities for exports and quality products. We should see the benefits in the next 5 years.
How do you feel about us being the first country in the world to have such a tax?
Yeah, look, I've probably got mixed feelings about it. John Key always used to say New Zealand should be a fast follower as opposed to, a leader. I would like to see other countries set an example that we knew worked. This is highly experimental and therefore highly risky. But, there's no reason why we can't go out with something that's not quite perfect and change and adapt as technology evolves and as markets change and evolve and consumer demands change and evolve. So, yes, I do think it comes with an element of risk. But I think if we proceed with caution in a way that's not going to put farmers out of business, then I think that will be okay.
Well, that is kind of connected to one of the questions that might come later around the price setting, who sets the prices. So I think that it should affect farming because I think we will have to make some changes in our farming systems to demonstrate to the world that we're pulling our weight in this with this issue. It's fundamental to our future on the planet. So it's not really something that, it's just about us. So I think it's really going to affect our farming industry, and the tax itself, it could do a bit of damage to those who can't find the opportunity in it and don't get on board early. Because I think if we don't make change with a little bit of a tax, then we'll get a bigger tax until we make change. So it's kind of like the naughty step. You'll be there for longer if you don't change your behaviour.
As I said before, we're such a small country, and I think it's going to open up opportunities. We certainly will create opportunities for income within the New Zealand ag sector, and will be certainly noticed as a country on the map.
What are your thoughts on how it will really affect the farming industry and communities?
The welfare of the agricultural community and rural communities. I think, I'm from a farming background. I've never seen anxiety as high as it is now. I've never seen confidence as low as it is now. And I think that the reaction to this He Waka, or the government's counter proposal to He Waka Kanoa, I think it has been an extraordinary reaction, because this is just the latest layer of compliance and complexity on top of many, many, many other layers of compliance and complexity. So I do really worry about the timing of it. I would like to see a pause on a whole lot of other stuff that's occurring in the background, so that farmers can understand this new proposal and work their business models, around this new proposal. I'd like to see the science and technology available. I'd like to see all the different mitigation options available, so that it doesn't become an onerous burden on top of these farmers.
Systems to demonstrate to the world that we're pulling our weight in this with this issue. It's fundamental to our future on the planet. So it's not really something that, it's just about us. So I think it's really going to affect our farming industry, and the tax itself. Yeah, well, it could do a bit of damage to those who can't find the opportunity in it and don't get on board early. Because I think if we don't make change with a little bit of a tax, then we'll get a bigger tax until we make change. So it's kind of like the naughty step. You'll be there for longer.
We will definitely have to have some clear guidelines on what is required to meet these emission standards, but once that is clear, I think farmers can work to compliance, and it will be make sure that everyone is to a certain standard of farming. Like anything, it takes time to get your head around it.
Do you think that it's fair that the plantings and shelter belts that farmers have done on their farms don't count towards this? And what about the grass that they grow?
There's a whole lot of science evolving around soil carbon capture, and indeed blue carbon, as they call oceans. The grass one is a bit difficult, because grass has a very short cycle. It grows, it gets eaten down, it grows, it gets eaten down. Actually, the science around the ability for grassland to capture carbon it is evolving, and there's a lot of different viewpoints on it. And especially here in New Zealand, where we have quite young soils, it's also a moot point. Whereas if you go to a country like Australia, where their soils are very, very old, the carbon is indeed easily identifiable and can be captured. But here it's just a bit difficult. So I think, we've always said we'd take a policy position based in the science. So if the science can prove that, then we'd look at it. But until that happens, it's a bit tricky.
The carbon accumulated in the plantings and shelter belts on most of our farms, say in the Canterbury Plains or something like that, it comes to very little, so it's insignificant. And the administration associated with keeping all of that recording is very onerous. In fact, it's more expensive than the value of the carbon that you get as a result. So in theory, it's a nice thing for farmers to have it, but in reality, it's tiny and probably not worth all the work it takes to count it. So that's the bit we don't hear very much about in the media, and people get angry about things that they probably wouldn't get angry about if they understood the rest of the story. When it comes to grass doesn't accumulate on an annual basis. In fact, say for example, at the start of calving, you have the same pre-grazing pasture mass most years. So because it over an annual cycle, it doesn't accumulate, you don't actually accumulate carbon in grass. So that's the reason why they shouldn't and don't get, and it doesn't count towards an offset.
Well, for us to advance in our agriculture and understanding of emissions, we already have the grass and the shelter belts. We need to improve further by actually having some mass plantings across New Zealand. The time has come for us to actually improve our farming practices, and shelter belts won't cut it.
Think about the emissions pricing being set by the government rather than an industry board like He Waka Iki Noa.
With a lot of the industry representatives in the last couple of weeks, they've always said that they don't necessarily want to set the price, but they certainly want to be consulted. And I think that's very fair, because those industry representatives are there representing the grassroots farmers, whether they're dairy farmers, whether they're sheep and beef, whether they're deer, it doesn't matter, but they need to be at that table and have a say. It was not up to the government to be able to dictate what the price should be.
Yeah, well, that bothers me somewhat, Matthew, because I'm a bit worried that it's a lot easier to go hard on a price when you're a little bit more removed from the people that are impacted by it. I would much rather the industry board, or perhaps it just inspires more of the people in the primary sector to get involved in central government politics. I think maybe we've had a break for a few too many decades, and we need to get back there so that we're involved.
I hope that the government has sought good advice on this, and that the industry board has been involved. By the sounds of it, there's been a lot of money spent on actually getting to this point of creating the emissions bill. So I'm hoping it's a good thing coming from government.
Yeah. And so Dairy NZ have indicated they feel a lot of work they put into the working group has been disregarded. Do you have any thoughts on the process, like you've already said, that you'd like to add on to?
Yeah, look, I entirely agree with that view. I mean, this thing has been 2.5, nearly 3 years of hard work, and I went to a couple of the road shows that Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb put on, and I was really impressed with what they presented. And I know a lot of the grassroots farmers don't necessarily agree with the proposal, and I know the submission period occurred at a very busy time in the farming calendar, and that they only got about 3,000 submissions when actually there's 23,000 farms in New Zealand. So some do argue it's not necessarily representative, but what I would say of the industry bodies is they gave it a good attempt, and it's better. The proposal is better than the emissions trading scheme, the ETS. So I can fully sympathise with the fact they're feeling really aggrieved right now that all of that work they've put in, all of that negotiation they've put in has just been effectively disregarded by the government, which, as you pointed out, wants to be the first in the world to charge farmers for the emissions, when it's not necessarily going to be a solution that is good for our country, let alone the agricultural sector.
Well, I think Dairy NZ did a huge amount in the process. In fact, I know they did. They did a huge amount for all of the farming sectors in New Zealand. I'm not entirely sure about which pieces have been disregarded. I do think that the dairy sector definitely earned a place on the price setting component. They led the charge, and they looked for the opportunity, and they were positive in it. So I'm a bit disappointed that didn't earn us the right to, or earn the primary sector the right to be involved in the price setting. Maybe I think the dairy sector also kind of came up with the concept of the incentive to net off. So if the He Waka part around the incentive lands, and it looks like government agreed with that, then maybe more of it will have been taken into consideration than they think at the moment. So I don't know. I think they didn't get everything from that government report that we thought we might for the primary sector. But I don't think it's all been disregarded either.
Yeah, I'm not sure where Dairy NZ is coming from. Beef and Lamb New Zealand have done a lot of consultation with their farmers, and I think that we're heading in the right direction. But Dairy NZ perhaps have got a lot more farmers with send to pivot irrigators and open spaces, so haven't taken into consideration planting of trees on their properties.
How effective do you think the submission process is going to be?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm a bit of a cynic in that we've seen so many times the government ignore what the agricultural sector is saying. But actually, the polling is showing that even the urban sector is 60% of the urban sector doesn't want to see farming taxed, because those urban voters know that that is going to increase the cost of their food. That this thing it will drive inflation. And so, New Zealanders are smart, and that's why I think the government better listen to the submissions proposal, and it better accept a proposal that's been driven from the grassroots up rather than from the top down, because this impacts all of New Zealanders, not just farmers.
Well, that's a juicy question, Matthew, because I think that you really have to understand the detail of it to be able to submit well. And I think that many people will get caught up on the same questions as you've raised in here around shelter belts and planting and things like that. And I'm not sure that that's useful in a submission process. So I do have a bit of a worry that unless somebody can, through their submission, can think of a better way and propose that it won't really land, because it's not a vote, it's not a democratic process. It's do you have an important point to raise or something that really needs consideration? And I'm not sure that there are too many new things to be raised. So I hope, and I do know a few people in the forestry sector that have got some really good concepts that they want to bring out through that, and they're dealing with ministers as well as through the submission process.
I think it's really important that every farmer in New Zealand has a say on this. So it may mean that when collating data, government may need to do this in a variety of ways to seek feedback from farmers of different ages, regions, and industries within the sector. So, I think that's where we're heading.
This is the same process as what they used for the freshwater accord. People were very angry about how the submissions did not seem to be taken into account, like you were saying, and that the new rules were added unfairly. Do you think the process will be similar or any better?
Well, isn't it interesting that nearly 3 years after that freshwater accord was announced, they still haven't put in place the framework for farmers to be able to submit their farm environment plans. That David Parker as the Minister for the Environment and Damien O'Connor as the Minister for Agriculture go out and make these great big announcements, but then they actually don't put the frameworks in place, and that's wholly unfair on farmers, because I think as of next week, as of November, farmers in Canterbury, for example, have to start putting in these farm environment plans, but they don't have the template to do it, so therefore they have to apply for resource consent. So this is just adding more and more stress and anxiety and compliance and complexity onto their businesses, when actually they just want to get on with doing their business. So I think it'll be very, very interesting to see how much, if any, of this proposal the government actually manages to get in place while it is still in government.
I hope it will be, because I agree entirely. The freshwater, or the national policy on freshwater 2020 and the national environmental standards, oh my goodness, that's something that our business is helping farmers with daily, and it is not good for the environment. So we're getting a completely unintended consequences of that regulation in our Canterbury client base. So I entirely agree that submissions were not listened to, and that has been an appalling process. I don't think I don't think that this government would make that same mistake twice, but they are very passionate about regulation, and that's probably a point where I just completely don't see the world through that lens. So I think people will be angry, but I think it's a real grunty issue, and probably the answer is a little bit unpleasant, but we've got to do stuff.
I definitely hope so, and that we have learnt from that, the Three Waters submissions, and that the government takes a bit more time in implementing the goals that from the outcomes from what's been talked about.
If it was up to you, if it was just up to you, would you be implementing this bill?
When they finally do agree on a proposal, then they have to bring the legislation back into Parliament. I think it's the zero carbon bill. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure which piece of legislation it actually falls under, but then we have to debate that piece of legislation. So as I said earlier, the National Party does believe that agriculture, like the energy sector, like the transport sector, is going to have to pay for emissions at some point. But we will only support a model that doesn't put farmers out of business and doesn't eat into their profits and their bottom lines. So it's really hard to say if we would support the legislation yet, because we don't know what it's going to look like. But certainly, if the current proposal the government has put out was to be the legislation, then I think we would oppose it.
I'll be making some changes. I wouldn't be implementing this bill because I wouldn't start with a tax if I wanted the change the way, and I wouldn't have said, "Here's a tax. You guys figure out how to set it or start at that point." I think that it would have been far better for people to understand the issue and then been set the challenge to solve it, rather than someone in central government just rolling with the pen. And they could have done that and still got some action on it just by working with primary sectors in a different way. So I would be implementing a bill. It would call for farmers to change, and some probably in a way that they would find unpleasant. And then I think, because it's an issue that is not easy solved, so it's going to be difficult. But I wouldn't have decided that central government could tax us on methane to get a change. I think that's going to have some very difficult consequences.
Yes, most definitely. I think we need to create a greener, cleaner New Zealand, and by doing more planting, it's offsetting emissions, creating native habitats for birds and wildlife, and making New Zealand a better place to live in.
Awesome. And any other thoughts about the zero carbon bill?
Nestle and Danone and all those huge offshore companies demanding of Synlait and of Fonterra that actually the milk you produce now has to be carbon zero. The industry has to be able to prove it is carbon zero, and however we do that, I think, will be dictated by the science. And the problem for us right now is it's still evolving. It's not quite there yet. So it is, I do absolutely appreciate that this is a really difficult time for the agricultural sector. And I would like things to just slow down, and I would really like to see our farmers thrive rather than just survive. And, if we can form a government, then that's certainly what I'll be advocating for.
The change the way, and I wouldn't have said, "Here's a tax, you guys figure out how to set it or start at that point." I think that it would have been far better for people to understand the issue and then been set the challenge to solve it, rather than someone in central government just rolling with the pen. And they could have done that and still got some action on it just by working with primary sectors in a different way. So I would be implementing a bill. It would call for farmers to change, and some probably in a way that they would find unpleasant. And then I think, because it's an issue that is not easy solved, so it's going to be difficult. But I wouldn't have decided that central government could tax us on methane to get a change. I think that's going to have some very difficult consequences because mitigations will come available to different sectors at different times. And so that's, I just wouldn't have started there. Well, I think it's okay to be first as long as you're smart about it. I'm not sure that we've got this bill perfect, and I think the best way will be to go softly for a start. And I hope central government understands the dynamic nature of our ecosystems and our farming businesses and the people, and that they realise that we're actually already adapting to climate change at the same time as we have to reduce our emissions. So, there's a little bit more to it. So I just hope.
It certainly has been a big process, and because we're the first in the world, we're sort of setting the benchmark for everybody else. It'll be interesting to see who else follows suit in the near future in terms of countries.